Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Antonaire, and this week we got one a little bit creepy crawly for you. We are joined by Dr. Tim McDermott from the Ohio State University Extension. Dr. McDermott is an expert in tick identification, prevention, and control, and we're very excited to have him here to share his knowledge with us. First, we'll discuss the different tick species, their habitats, and the diseases that they can transmit. We'll also learn about the tick life cycle and how to identify and remove ticks safely, and of course the best methods for tick prevention. Finally, Dr. McDermott answers some of our listener questions, including the latest update on Lyme disease vaccine clinical trials and his current research. With turkey season in Ohio only being a few short weeks away, we hope this episode helps you take the necessary steps to keep you tick-free this season. Please welcome Dr. Tim McDermott. All right. Well, sir, like I said earlier, good morning. Thank you for taking the time. I know we have been trying to, connect about this. You've had a pretty busy February, and so, getting into March here, now we're ready to go. But again, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Anxious to talk about ticks and the upcoming tick season.
I know it's approaching quickly. And like I mentioned earlier too, with these warmer days that we've been having, 70 degrees in February, the tick activity's definitely already started. So I'm excited to have you on and talk about this. Like I also said, this is going to be very informative about ticks and tick prevention. I think this is something that people really, truly need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
I think some people don't give it as much credit as what it deserves. And I by no means want to make people scared of going outside, as a turkey hunter and as a guy that likes to hike and explore what Ohio has to offer. I think it's very important that people are prepared. And preparedness obviously is going to lead you to having a much, much better time in the woods and keep you safer. So I definitely don't want this to scare anyone off by any means. But Tim, I know you're a Vance customer. We kind of talked a little bit about that. So he spent some money with us. So we do appreciate that. It's always better when someone's a customer. But let's go ahead and give us a brief background on yourself, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
My name is Tim McDermott. I work for Ohio State University in Extension in Agriculture and Natural Resources here in Franklin County. I have been with Extension for about the last 8 years or so. I'm second career. I practiced veterinary medicine in Franklin County and companion animal medicine. And then when I transitioned over to Extension, I do pretty much a dual role. About half of my time is in urban agriculture and local food systems, and then the other half is doing veterinary work. I do a lot of work in tick vector disease and tick vector disease prevention, basically from my veterinary background. When I was a veterinarian, we talked about arthropod vector diseases to dogs and cats at pretty much every 15 minutes during every appointment. And when I transitioned into Extension, I found we really did not have that sizable amount of public health outreach that we needed to let folks know about really what's coming and the state of ticks in Ohio going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. You go to your vet's office. I mean, I know that I do. Every time I'm there, they're always talking about flea and heartworm, or flea, tick, and heartworm. It's always a thing for us. And so, I know when we kind of talked earlier, I feel like when I hear about ticks, I feel like as a kid, and kind of like you mentioned, I don't feel like they were as prevalent, maybe, or maybe I was a little bit more naive when I was younger. But now I feel like as an adult, with 2 kids of my own, I feel like I'm having an encounter with at least 1 or 2 tick encounters per kid. Each kid is, and that's not roughing around in the woods and, getting into high brush that's taller than them. That's them just playing outside in our grass. And so I feel like it's definitely becoming more popular and more on top of people's mind, I guess I should say. Would you agree, Tim?
Oh, you are 100% spot on. It is different now. I grew up in the woods when I was a kid, and ticks were gross, and maybe you found one on you, you picked it off, you discarded it, but you really weren't worried about it vectoring the disease to you. And that is really the heart of the matter is, there are some myths that are out there that we really need to dispel through through public health outreach, right? I had mentioned earlier we're getting ready to go into tick season. While there is a increased amount of tick activity from April through September, quite honestly, you can encounter a tick in any day, any month, all year long in Ohio, and there are certain ticks that are fairly active even at cold temperatures. And then, another myth is you are only going to encounter a tick in the woods, and quite honestly, there's a couple of ticks that really are preferential for woods habitat, like the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick, or the Lone Star tick. But, the American dog tick or the Gulf Coast tick is a couple of tick species that they're just as happy to be living in your backyard lawn. And so we really need to kind of get the word out regarding the seasonality. As a hunter, you guys know you have a risk of encountering a tick when you go out in the woods. But when we look at, say, the life cycle of the deer tick, right now is the spike that we have for early season adult emergence, and we've already seen that started. In fact, we saw that in February when we got a really early warm-up. Then we're going to go into huge numbers of nymphs, and a deer tick nymph is extraordinarily small. It is as big as the period at the end of a sentence, and it is fully capable of vectoring disease to you. And then when we get into deer hunting season, we have a corresponding spike again of deer tick adults. And so when we're out hunting deer, the deer ticks are out hunting us at the same time.
I was just going to let that one sit for a minute. That's a great quote. No, yeah, you definitely see, like I said earlier, my kids, it's definitely been the American dog tick. One thing that I've been able to really do since becoming, here at Vance Outdoors is really dive into, especially starting the podcast, is really dive into some of those things as well. To me, before, like I mentioned, a tick was a tick, is a tick. Like, they're all creepy, they're all crawly, they're all gross. But then, you really start to dive into different species. And I've heard you talk in a different appearance too. I feel like the dog tick and the deer tick are definitely more common in terms of what people know and what people see. But I think it was really important to address. There are, I think, 5 current species right now that we've seen in Ohio. Is that true?
Yes, so we have gone from 1 tick of medical importance to humans, companion animals, and livestock 20 years ago to 5 now. And 2 of those have really only exploded onto the scene in Ohio in the last couple years. So when I was back in private practice, the American dog tick was the tick that I would see more commonly on companion animals. Around 2010, we had our first detection of a deer tick. It was in Coshocton County in Ohio. 2014-15, we had detections of the Lone Star tick, predominantly in the wooded southern Ohio counties. And then in the last few years, we have had established colonies of the Gulf Coast tick, which is not a new or invasive tick in America. It's actually one of the longest studied. But then we also had first positive detections of the true invasive Asian longhorn tick in Ohio.
Yeah, and I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, there was some research that they were doing with, not research, I guess it's research, but stray dogs. I think I heard you talk about stray dogs and the research that going on, once they've captured these stray dogs and they're kind of processing them, they do a little tick study, if you will, on what they found.
Yeah, so the first county where we had a detection of Asian longhorn ticks was from a rescue dog in Gallia County, which is pretty much straight south of Columbus down 23. That dog went to the humane organization and they cleaned it up and examined it. They pulled a tick off it and they sent that up to Ohio State, and that tick was the first true detection of Asian longhorn ticks. So then the next spring, we were looking to see if we could try to figure out if we had any other counties that had any positive detections. We have a research farm in Jackson County, which is the next door neighboring county, and they were getting ready to work animals. They do beef cattle and small ruminants there, sheep. And so in early spring, we sent a team from Ohio State down there, and as they were running the animals through the chute, they were doing tick checks on them, and they did find an Asian longhorn tick, so Jackson became our second county. And then later that summer, I got a call from a colleague of mine from Monroe County, and he had called because there was actually fatalities in cattle at his next-door neighbor And when we examined that situation, it was found to have extraordinary numbers of Asian longhorn ticks infesting that pasture that caused cattle fatality. And then last year, we had 2 other large numbers of cattle, ticks on cattle. And the good news is those cattlemen organizations had awareness of that because we've been going around the state. I travel and talk to cattlemen and other organizations. So
Sure.
They were checking their animals pretty good. That was in Morgan County and that was in Belmont County. We then also had a detection in Guernsey County. That was pulled off a gray fox. And then our most recent one is Franklin County. There was actually an Asian longhorn tick found on a person walking their dog over by Easton. So we got 7 counties in Ohio now.
How does something like that spread? You look at like the Asian longhorn, obviously it's coming from Asia. How does something like that even get across the ocean and get to the United States?
That we actually don't know. The first mass emergence was in 2017 in New Jersey on a farm, and it was on a sheep, and they have no idea how it got there. The animal, the family, the neighbors, nobody's been to East Asia. So they did some checks on ticks that had been previously submitted that were in storage, and they did find that there was one maybe on a dog and a deer in like 2010, 2013. But how it got here is anybody's guess. The worry with that tick is it really only takes one, because the Asian longhorn tick can reproduce by a parthenogenesis, which means a female can just spontaneously lay clutches of eggs. And so conceivably, somebody could have just been on an airplane over there or had their dog and come over. They bring one, nymph, and you wouldn't even know. And then that tick could land here, and if the environmental conditions are right and they have food, then they could establish a colony right off the bat.
Well, we're like 10 minutes in. I'm not ready to quit. No, I'm just kidding. One thing that we didn't talk about, which is one I feel like is before the Asian longhorn, a lot of people would probably consider this to probably be the scariest one, and that would be the Lone Star, primarily just because of the alpha-gal allergy that it can inhibit into somebody. If we can, let's dive into that, because I think we did miss that one a little bit, but we are finding those in southern Ohio as well, correct?
Yes, I would say that if you did a tick drag in southern Ohio, Riverbend, wooded counties, depending on what time of year you're dragging, you're going to probably predominantly find Lone Stars down there. And so when we talk about ticks and the diseases they can vector or transmit through their feeding bacterial, viral, and protozoal diseases, and they all sort of have their favorites. So they don't necessarily vector all of them. Each tick has sort of the couple few that they're known for, like American dog tick is noted for transmission of Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
Okay.
The number one tick on my current hit parade in terms of public health worry, I would definitely say is the deer tick. The sheer volume of devastating diseases that it can vector, Lyme disease, Powassan virus, encephalitis, they're just no joke. But one of the ticks sort of subsequent things that can happen if you get bit by the Lone Star tick that really gets people's attention is there are some chemical similarities in the saliva of the Lone Star tick that are very similar to non-primate mammalian muscle. And if you get bit by a Lone Star tick and your immune system reacts negatively to that, you can then become allergic to non-primate mammalian muscle, which means you just became allergic to beef, pork, lamb, venison. And as a person whose favorite food in the entire world is a bacon cheeseburger, I do not want a bacon cheeseburger allergy.
I mean, and I want to dive into that a little bit more, but before we get into this, the allergy, I've actually heard you say too, the Lone Star, or not necessarily the Lone Star tick, but that allergy you've seen across the world as well, where ticks weren't present. Is that one, or am I thinking the same thing?
Well, we see it where ticks are present, and it is associated with ticks. We might see it in places that we don't necessarily have Lone Star ticks. And so the worry would be that other tick species can potentially induce this allergy in people whose immune system reacts negatively. In fact, there is a portion of Japan that they have a spike of alpha-gal, or the mammalian muscle allergy, and the predominant tick there is the Asian longhorn tick. And so the worry would be that that tick could also potentially be associated with alpha gal. And I've seen research on it that hasn't definitively linked it, but there is a sort of a causality there.
And probably that has definitely some cause for concern given the fact that how they can breed, and spontaneously have a cluster of eggs. So, I mean, obviously it's going to be hard to control if we do find that that's the case on that one for sure. But yeah, it's good. I'm going back to alpha gal because I think this is something that a lot of people, they raise their eyebrows at. Not cause for concern, but obviously the allergy to red meat. Have you seen, or has there been research to show that people can? Because I've seen it kind of both ways. Some people that's just what they have for life, and I've seen some people, 6 months later, a year later, they're kind of fine. They may get bit by a tick again and kind of have a resurgence in their allergy, or maybe they get infected again. Have you seen people kind of wane out of the allergy, or is that something that they're going to basically have for their lifespan?
Well, immune systems are funny things, and they really are individual to the person.
Sure.
So I have seen some research that shows that it can wane over time in some people, but re-exposure can then flare it up again. So anyone that would have that would really, really want to go deep into their tick protective behaviors to potentially allow their immune function to decrease in terms of its inflammatory response to that. And the hope would be that they could recover over time. But it really is individual, quite honestly.
So getting into that, so we have the 5 tick species. Hopefully we're not seeing any more yet in Ohio. But the 5 species we covered, the American dog tick, black-legged tick or the deer tick, Lone Star, Gulf Coast, and the Asian longhorn. You think out of those 5, what caused the most cause for concern from you is the deer tick, just based on the amount of different types of diseases that it can carry?
Currently.
Okay.
I would say that the Asian longhorn tick would be the contender to the champ, though, if we find out what it can vector, because that's one of the things that is getting heavily studied right now. Since it's not from here, can it actually vector the diseases we have here?
Sure.
And we know that over in its native host range, it can vector some truly horrendous diseases. What we have found so far is there are some things that we've detected when we sample an Asian longhorn tick that's wild caught, and there are some things that we found that it can transmit in the lab. But right now, the only thing that we found it to be a competent vector in a real-world situation would be the transmission of Theileria, which is a protozoal parasite that affects cattle. And we have had a positive case of thyleritis in a beef cow here in Ohio.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I'm glad you elaborated a little more on that. Getting into the identification process and kind of the process of someone once they become infected. There was one study that I researched. So my brother actually worked for the Licking County Health Department prior to he moved to D.C. and now is working for the federal government. And he sent me an article that they just posted in March, a couple weeks ago. We're based out of Licking County. I know Tim's based out of Franklin County, but I think it's very important for people to understand this, that Licking County reported in 2021 between June, or most of the cases reported in June, but between May and September, there were over 148 cases of Lyme disease in the Licking County alone. I mean, that's just that area. Mm-hmm. Not all those people are hunters and going out and turkey hunting. Yeah. And so getting into the identification process, I'm John Smith. I live in Sunbury and I'm just mowing my grass, in my residential neighborhood. How do I identify each one of these ticks that are more common for me in this particular area? Some of the characteristics of them, if you will. I don't want people to go out and be a Google researcher. I want them to kind of understand the process a little bit.
So really, we are actually creating a website at Ohio State that is under construction right now, where we're going to host all of our content in one space with great links out to Ohio Department of Health and things like that. Currently, my favorite website in terms of research and fact-based information would be tickencounter.org, all one word, tickencounty.org, and that is, I believe, the University of Rhode Island, and over there in New England, they've really, they're ahead of the curve on us in terms of how bad they have it. So I would say your best bets for learning about ticks and getting more information are going to be going to like Ohio Department of Health, going to the CDC, and then I tell folks if you really want to do great research online, because Google can be a scary place,
Oh, sure.
but add the word extension to your search terms,
Yes.
and then what that does is it will bring up land-grant university, like Ohio State, research publications and fact sheets, and sort of will winnow out some of the chaff from the wheat.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how all those college courses that I hated that I had to do my research on now are really important to me because there's so much misinformation. Well, citing your source, it's, I was kind of going through college when internet was really going to be our main source of media, but this main source of information, but you still had to make sure it was published or, it was an actual publication and not something that was just said on the web or opinion based. And so, and you mentioned New England. I believe I heard on, I can't remember the doctor's name, but he was on Joe Rogan, which ultimately is the biggest podcasting platform that's out there, was sharing some light of some information regarding tick research in New England area, which I'm not sure where they make the cutoff. I'm just going to say probably New York up. They had, according to this research, that they found over 60% of the ticks harvested through tick drags contain some type of vector disease. Which is just, it blows your mind. You're more likely to get a disease in the New England states than you are not to.
And we're collecting similar data in Ohio through, colleagues of mine at Ohio State, and we are seeing pretty high prevalence levels. It can be anywhere from 40 to 60% of ticks in a given county can have a disease, and if they don't have one, they can't vector it to you.
Sure.
But with very high prevalence rates, it does mean your risk of contracting a disease from a tick is larger than it would be with low. And in some places, there's just hot spots. You know what I mean? You might find a place where there's really low prevalence, and then you might have a hot spot that's just crazy.
Yeah.
There was a county in western Pennsylvania. They did a public park tick drag for deer ticks, and then they tested them for Powassan virus encephalitis, and the prevalence rates were over 75% of ticks in that public park. Wow. No joke.
That's wild. It's wild. We mentioned tick drags a couple of times. I think let's get into the show. Like how does that research happen? Like are we just dragging cloth, or what kind of research are we doing, or what's the process of collecting ticks through these areas?
So tick drags are pretty old school methods of doing a tick collection. So when a tick is hunting, they hunt by equesting. Basically, you have a tick, and ticks are not insects, they're arthropods, but they're, arachnids, so closer to spiders. So picture a tick with its 8 legs. An adult or a nymph has 8 legs. The larval form only has 6, and then they develop that extra pair of legs as they move their life cycles. But equesting is, they're holding on to the vegetation with the back pair of legs, and their front legs are looking for a host that they can feed on. So with a tick drag, you take like a grabby fabric, more like a felt or something that is not really smooth, at a measured amount. Like go with a square meter or a square yard, and that way you have a unit of measurement. And then you can drop it down and swipe through the vegetation to grab questing ticks. And then what you do is you pull it up, take like a cat hair lint roller, you know what I mean, and you try to grab the ticks off, and then you can sample in an area, and then you can do the mathematics in the area with how many samples you took at a unit of measurement to get an idea of population per square, whatever your other unit of measurement is.
Now, how does the identification process of the actual vector disease, or is that like something where they're crushed and blend? Like, how does the science of that?
You got it. You bet. PCR testing for the prevalence of disease inside.
Perfect. Yep. I actually saw, I'm a big fan of Dr. Grant Woods. He runs a Growing Deer TV page there on YouTube in South Missouri. I think you've seen some of his stuff too. He's a big whitetail guy, but does a lot of science-based information in terms of the biology of the land and what have you. And I think they've done several studies where they wear the painter suits, the
tie it up, right?
Yep. And they're just walking through, and then anytime they see one, they're hitting it with the packing tape. And he collected, I think the one that I watched, I turned it off, but he collected maybe like 20 within the first 15 feet of this piece of food plot that he had, where it had kind of grown up a little bit more of a CRP type of field, which obviously is prime habitat. diving into the habitat and let's get into the life cycle. Each one of these ticks you had mentioned earlier have like kind of a preferred area, if you will. The dog tick is more happy to be in your, nice manicured lawn versus the deer tick at times can be in the deeper woods. What's kind of the preferred habitat of these? And then after we get into that, let's kind of dive into the life cycle of these.
You bet. So ticks are very adaptable, and they really can adjust. If they find a place that's even close to what they can accept and there's a food source there, we're finding that they are able to kind of persist, especially if they have what they would need for whatever temperature is best for them and whatever relative humidity they can exist at.
Okay.
So you do have, say, the American dog tick and the Gulf Coast tick, and they would be able to tolerate a little bit more sun, quite honestly. They're not going to desiccate out as much, so you'll see them in a lawn or a meadow or a pasture or something like that,
okay,
a little bit in a higher prevalence. The Lone Star tick and the deer tick are woods preferential ticks. They like to have a little bit more shade, and they're going to be found more in the woods. But especially with the deer tick, they can tolerate cold much better than most ticks.
Sure.
Contrast that with, say, the Asian longhorn tick, and it has a pretty high relative humidity that it needs, and it likes warmer temperatures as well. So it's not nearly as cold tolerant as a deer tick would be.
Perfect. Yeah, and that kind of leads me right into that next thing as well. So the life cycle, we had mentioned earlier, general misconception is that, through the winter, ticks are, either eradicated or dormant. Obviously, they're clearly not eradicated because they're coming back next spring. If they were, then they wouldn't. But, they're dormant during the colder months in the winter. And what I'm primarily concerned with this too is especially with these warmer winter months that we've been having. It's been unseasonably warm all year. I can only count maybe 5 cumulative snows that I know of off the top of my head. Yeah. Especially like we talked about earlier in February, we had a few days that were in the 70-degree range. Is that warmer? I'm assuming that the warmer winters are definitely going to hinder us a little bit in terms of tick population coming forward to this year.
Well, I can tell you that we are seeing tick host range expansion secondary to global climate change, and so that is going to affect our numbers, and it's one of the drivers behind the very rapid change from the way it was and the way it is right now. In terms of life cycle, this really only struck me a few years ago. I've been doing presentations for a long time, and I would always talk about the life cycle of ticks. And here's the thing. They're so good at transmitting disease because they live a really long time. A tick could live for years. I mean, contrast that with the other arthropods that we think are common. A flea doesn't live for years. A fly or an ant, they don't live for years. But a tick can live, like a deer tick's normal life cycle is a 2-year life cycle. And if conditions are not right for them to emerge and feed, they can stay in a state of hypobiosis for longer than that. And then they emerge, and then they can feed. And they truly are a 12-month problem. We have positive cases of Lyme disease reported in Ohio every single month of the year.
That's wild. That's wild. Do you think that maybe they don't get as much credit in those late? So I'm looking, let's say the deer hunter in the rut, mid-November into December, you get into like the gun season where you're kind of tailing off into December. Obviously, there's clearly less vegetation available. I mean, most of it at this point is either fallen or, the bushes and the briars and all that stuff is typically kind of beat down a little bit. Do you think that people don't see as much transmission because there's not as much hanging surface, if you will, or brush, you're not, brush busting, if you will, I guess is what I'm getting at. Is that kind of what your thought is too?
Well, and you probably have less people out.
Yeah, sure.
It's just simply a decreased amount of engagement in the habitat. Because we do see much higher, rates of disease diagnosis and transmission in the warmer months, but we don't see a decrease to zero at any point. And in fact, I've seen some data where it shows that while we definitely have higher rates of positivity in the warmer months and rural environments, that actually when you get to the colder months, you will have a little spike in positivity rates in the urban environments, potentially because we have urban heat environments that stay a little warmer in the city
Sure,
than out in
sure.
the country.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, cool. Now, all the bad news aside, let's talk about what we can do as outdoor enthusiasts to protect ourselves. There's a lot of scary stuff that we just talked about, but there is a way that we can help protect ourselves. So let's get into some of the best practices that we can do. For me, top of the list, I'm sure for you as well, permethrin is definitely probably one of those products that I feel like everyone needs to get comfortable with.
Yep. I highly recommend permethrin treated clothing. Okay. You can treat it yourself. You can purchase from any outfitter treated clothing. If you're going to treat it yourself, make sure that you use a permethrin that is labeled for fabric. Permethrin has been around forever. There's a million formulations. You want to treat your clothing with permethrin labeled for use on fabric. And then on your skin, you're going to put a topical repellent. And there's lots of them out there. So I don't say to anyone, use this one or use that one. I say, be a label reader. You want to read that label. You want to make sure that the repellent that you're using is appropriate for the audience and the situation, and know about its effectiveness, because there's some that folks might think are labeled for ticks, but they're not strong enough to actually be a tick repellent. It is the law that you are required to read, understand, and follow the label on any of the pesticides or repellents that you would use. And then I highly recommend long pants, long sleeves, light colored clothing, and that way you can see if you have a tick that has attached via questing and is trying to move to a feeding space. I also recommend highly that you come in from an environment that you have any kind of tick concerns, which can be about any environment.
Sure.
Get those clothes in the washer. You can even just put them in the dryer for 20 minutes on high to desiccate those ticks. But do a very thorough tick check on yourself to try to catch them before they embed, because if you catch them before they embed, you've eliminated the chance that you're going to have one of them feeding on you and potentially vectoring disease. I tell folks, make sure that you prioritize your four-legged friends in terms of part of your biosecurity. Your dogs and your cats are living in tick environment. They are tick magnets. They don't do tick checks, but we have the best actual tick preventative stuff for anybody. Humans, livestock, companion animals have it way better than everybody.
Sure.
Work with your vet to make sure that you're using a product that fits in your budget. And then, quite honestly, the best management practice you have is awareness. It's your brain. Realize where you're going to have a higher risk or where you're going to have a lower risk. I still go out. I still hike. I'm in the woods, but I am not blazing my way through the honeysuckle patch anymore. Stay to the middle of the trail. Wear your gear. Use your topical repellents. Do your tick checks, and that will go a long way to keeping you and your family tick safe.
That's perfect. That's perfect advice. Yeah, and it echoes everything I think. And I'm glad that you didn't want to call out a specific repellent, if you will, in terms of topical. Like for instance, my daughter, I've probably gone through 15 different sunscreens just trying to find one that wouldn't break her out. And so it's going to be the same exact thing. One thing I did have a question about, we mentioned about the different types of permethrin. Obviously, there's already diluted, 0.5%, 0.5% permethrin, looking at like Sawyer's and whatever have you. But there's also permethrin that is petroleum based as well as water based. Do you have any difference between those?
The only recommendation that you are required by federal law to do is follow the label on what you're allowed to use that product on in the manner consistent with its labeling. Perfect.
And the other thing too, for those listening, I mean, if you are interested in purchasing, he did say there are companies out there. Game Hide comes up as an example. The new Sika stuff, like I just purchased this year. In the hunting space, Sika brand camo has made it very important for them to start to already treat their garments, especially the turkey season garments, with permethrin. So insect shield, they've added some different things just to kind of keep people safe in that regard. So that's something that I actually picked up prior to this conversation because I'm starting to get a feel for how serious this actually is. I'm not going to gamble with it as much anymore. And so that's the thing that someone can do as well. Let's say they're not comfortable with mixing a chemical and spraying it. They can purchase a garment. And I'm sure there are other hiking companies as well that already have garments that are, I think Insect Shield is the name of the company, if I'm not mistaken, that I've seen. But so you can do that route as well. Keep yourself safe in that regard. And then obviously tick checking.
Yep.
Making sure, looking at your kids, looking at your dogs. One thing I found that was interesting with the research, and I didn't even know this, and it's different for felines, but on the canine side, I've seen that you can actually treat your and as a vet, you might be able to talk about this a little bit too, but treat your dog with permethrin in terms of a spray as well, in addition to the flea and tick medicine.
I would. Permethrin was really the first generation of external parasite protection for fleas and ticks way back in the day. I would say that the stuff that we have nowadays is so much better than the stuff we had then.
Okay.
That would not be my first choice if I was looking to do tick prevention for my dogs. And permethrin is toxic to cats. It will cause a neurotoxicity.
Yeah, I was gonna say it affects their central nervous system, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah. So definitely don't spray your cat with that. That's for sure. I do not want you to do that on our behalf. Well, that's pretty cool. Did you have anything that kind of question you had before we get into some of these listener comments as well?
Oh, we covered everything. I had a question except one thing. If you do have one attach,
yes, thank you.
What's the proper way to get rid of it? Because you have those things like, well, at least when I was growing up, I always remember someone saying light a match and stick it on the tick and then pull it off. So maybe we should have you discuss the proper way to remove one if it does attach itself to you.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'm surprised I forgot about that.
Excellent question. Yeah, when I was in private practice, I saw every last goofy thing you can imagine. Dogs would be coming in covered with motor oil, you name it. There is actual research that shows if you inappropriately remove a tick, like try to burn it off or something like that, you would increase your chances of having disease transmitted from that tick if it was carrying it.
Sure.
So there's really one way, because you need to get the entire tick out. So you take pointy tweezers or one of the tick removal tools that allow you to get way down to the head. You got to get all the way down where the mouth parts are embedded, and then you have to firmly pull straight up to get the entire tick out. And then you want to wash your hands and you want to wash the spot. And then if you want to have that tick evaluated, that tick goes in a plastic bag, and the perfect medium to hold it in is what we all have all over the place now. That would be hand sanitizer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So just have some hand sanitizer in a plastic bag. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yep. You can submit the tick for identification to your public health organization, and there are companies that you can actually submit it to that will test it for prevalence of pathogen. And then contact your human health physician and talk to them about what happens in case they would want to evaluate you for medical treatment.
Exactly. So I'm assuming that you would suggest if you did have an encounter where you had an attachment, you would probably prefer people to save that for a few weeks to see if they have any type of symptoms or signs of Lyme disease or even more, going to Rocky Mountain spotted fever and all those as well.
I would say if you pull a tick off you with the prevalence rates we have now, contact your physician so that they can give you guidance right off the bat, and I wouldn't even wait a few weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and that's the thing that I've started to do last year as well. I think my daughter had one on her head, and we kept it for a while just to kind of see. And it helped give me a good idea of how to properly identify as well, because now I can look at it in a controlled environment. This is definitely a deer tick. Like, this is a female, because the pictures are available online, especially with the websites that he suggested. So you can really properly identify where you got that and make the best course of action for it. So, well, cool. There's a lot of gimmicky stuff out there. So I want people to really understand this as well. What's your thought on obviously the preferred method is to have a clean, close to the skin contact as you can, pull straight up. I've seen some goofy stuff that's like spin the tick out so just disregard that. Take your old fashioned pair of tweezers that you're using to pluck your eyebrow, grab the tick cleanly as close as you can to the skin, and pull exactly 90 degrees away from the skin.
Yep, that's my only recommendation. All the other ones, you're not trying to convince it to walk away. You want to get that tick off you the right way. And the way that will minimize any further disease transmission.
Before we get into the listener questions, I did have one thing I want to dive back on. The attachment points, typically, I think this is, if someone is doing a thorough tick check, it's easy to see your legs, it's easier to see your arms. Obviously, there's those places, your head. That's why I keep my hair nice and buzz short so my wife can see very easy. But, with my daughter and my son, checking the tops of your heads, checking your armpits, checking in your waistline. What are the key areas that someone should really try to tend to focus on when looking for doing a self check on ticks?
Well, you hit on those. Ticks basically are going to walk until they find an obstruction or they find a preferred feeding spot, and they like to find a spot that the host will not find them or
Sure.
be able to get them off. And we do see with different ticks in different species, different favorite attachment points on there. So I do recommend you look and do your best tick check on yourself, and then find that special someone that can check the parts of you that you can't see, and make sure that you are getting a good look all over to catch anything that might be walking around before it embeds on you.
Just like the Brad Paisley song. Check you for tick. There, thumbs up. Brad Paisley knew what he was talking about. I don't think he was looking at ticks, but we'll accept it. Well, I did want to get into some of these listener questions. I submitted some on behalf of myself and just on my own personal Facebook page and some accounts I'm a part of, but also through Vance Outdoors, we submitted some questions. And I feel like it's important to we just kind of address these real quick. One thing that I think we can kind of touch on, which is kind of hopeful a little bit, would be according to the CDC, and I don't have names on the people that to put these on here, so I apologize for that. But if you hear yours, you know that we got it answered. But one question I had was, according to the CDC, there are clinical trials of new vaccines for Lyme disease that are currently underway. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, on my research, it's in phase 3 testing. Is that kind of hopeful for you, or where do you stand on that?
Yes, so I've heard the same, that they are doing clinical trials of a Lyme vaccine for humans, and I think that will be a tool in our toolbox, especially when we, kind of couple that with all the other things that we talked about. I would not use that as your sole tick preventative, if that makes sense, because you might go into the woods and you would be, safe against Lyme disease and then get a bacon cheeseburger allergy from a Lone Star tick. So it's a tool in the toolbox, right? But not the only tool in our toolbox.
And the reason I think that question is brought up, because we see obviously the flea and tick medication on the vet side. People are wondering, okay, we've had this stuff around forever for canines and felines, and name your animal, but we haven't really seen any headway. I believe there was a vaccine earlier in the 2000s that kind of phased out after a while, but we haven't seen anything in recent years. And with the increase of encounters, I feel like that's something that people are concerned about. Why don't we have some type of vaccine or medication to kind of help with these diseases?
I think they're working on some of that stuff, but you're 100% right. The puppies and the kitties got it so much better than we have. I mean, they got good stuff. Raise your hand if you would put the drops behind your shoulder blades right now.
No joke. No joke.
I'll be like, honey, put the drops on me. It's that time.
Yeah. And I think you make a good point on that, too, because that's going back to Jordan pre this conversation. So I have a little Yorkie. He's a cat is bigger. He's a little 7-pound lap dog, but he goes outside, obviously with his leash to go to the bathroom. Maybe 5 times. He's 12. 5 or 6 times I've had a tick on him. Typically on his head or behind his ears. And I've been one. Don't hate me too much, but I've been one to kind of pass on that just based on the fact that he is an inside dog. But now it's like, oh man, I should probably be a little bit more cognizant of that for sure. So that was a great question that the user brought, the listener submitted. So I'm glad that we were able to address that. The next one I had here were, what are some of the best methods of lowering ticks? My daughter wants to know, how come you can't just get rid of them? She's 6 years old. Some of the best methods of lowering ticks in open acreage. So for me, for instance, I find that in my area, I joke because as we speak, my woods is getting cleared. The underbrush is getting cleared with the forestry mulcher. So I'm doing my part to get rid of all that habitat. But, I find that keeping my grass a little bit lower, not having such a long grass, keeping the wood line back a little bit. What are some of those best methods that you would say to help lower the population in some of those open areas or just grass areas?
So, yeah, we'll use like a typical backyard as an example of where you're going to find ticks. So ticks they don't spend very much time on the host, right? We're the restaurant, but we're not the house, and so they're going to be in the environment. There's going to be a relatively small percentage that are going to be sort of in that bright sunshine part of the backyard, especially in mown grass. Where you see it a lot is the edge habitat, right? Say your house backs up to the woods. Really, the zone of the highest danger is about 3 meters on either side of that edge habitat. You can put a barrier, sort of, like a gravel barrier or a wood mulch barrier. Brush piles and leaf piles are ideal tick habitat. If you're putting the swing set up, I wouldn't butt it right up against the woods, because then your kids are going to be right in that edge habitat. Same with your garden. Kind of try to move it away a little bit closer to that the middle or the sunnier area. But it's really difficult to eliminate ticks from an environment. And there's been a bunch of studies. There's a really interesting study. It's called the Tick Report, if you Google it. And they use tick tubes and they use bait stations for deer. And they found that the amount of work and how often you have to replenish that to really make a dent in a space is just vast, because they breed in such high numbers and they're mobile on wildlife, including the Asian longhorn tick is mobile on migratory waterfowl. So they can reestablish in a space very quickly. And a lot of the products that we would apply, like to spray your lawn, they have to contact the tick to work. And so, they might kill something that's in there. They're probably going to kill every non-target insect and arthropod in the environment as well. But then you might have a bunch of deer go moving through the yard, and you could reestablish within a short period.
Yeah, we're definitely fighting an uphill battle in that regard, aren't we?
Yeah. Your daughter's a wise woman, but people ask me that all the time. What eats ticks? What makes them go away? And they would be something that certain species would eat, but we haven't at this time seen a increase in a tick predator to match the increase in ticks as food.
Yeah, and the one that comes to mind a lot too, as turkey hunter, I'm kind of like, but you hear a lot of people talk about possum. And do they eat enough to combat? No, I would say probably not. But going back to like the myths and the rumors and stuff that you can just find on the internet, as a turkey hunter, the possum are way more detrimental to my turkey habitat than they are to what they're providing me on the tick side. I'll just keep treating my clothes to get those hatches and clutches of turkey.
Yeah, and the study that was out a long time ago with possums as tick vacuums has actually been disproven. There was some flaws in the design, and so it would be nice if they actually were a preferential tick vacuum, and then we could all just sprinkle a box of possums all over the yard, but not actually the case.
No, I'll take now one thing I do have, I do let my chickens free range in my grass, and so that's another thing as well. I feel like my numbers, I don't see them as often, but then again, I could just not have encounters, but I love watching them out there just pecking. I'm like, hopefully every time they peck, hopefully they're getting a tick. That would be great. Similar to how the deer management is done and how the turkey population management is done, is anyone looking at the tick numbers? I know I've heard you talk about this before, but there's clearly certain regions of our state that have more prevalence. Is there anyone looking at very specific geographic locations in terms of where things are, how things are migrating throughout the state?
We've really started doing deep dives into that research recently. And so I can say that data is currently being collected by any number of different organizations, academia and public health, and we should have actionable data going forward.
Perfect. A question I had here from another hunter, and this is kind of a two-part, but deer are affected by Lyme disease, is that correct?
No, they don't get Lyme disease.
But they can be a carrier.
They're a blood reservoir, and food then is more of the transportation and food source.
And so can new ticks, obviously, if there's and I'm assuming the answer is yes on this, but I don't want to make sure I ask it the way they did. So let's say a deer is affected by a tick or does have the vector transmission of a tick that does have Lyme disease, and it has another host, another tick come on it after the fact. That tick could, that tick could in regard get that Lyme disease from the deer itself, correct? The second tick or the transmission.
So the ticks are probably picking up. I mean, there's not a vertical spread of Lyme disease, so mama's not laying eggs that have Lyme.
Okay.
So likely the host that would have been transmitting that might have been in an earlier feeding,
Okay.
if that makes sense. And not every species carries Lyme. We've really only found that deer ticks are vectors of Lyme disease.
Perfect. Any reason why this is particularly important for all us turkey hunters? And, I was just over there, last week. But is there any reason why there are heavier numbers in southern and southeast Ohio as opposed to the rest of the state? Is it mainly just habitat?
It is mainly habitat, yep. But we are seeing deer in every last square inch of the state,
Sure.
urban or rural. And so likely, we have established populations of deer ticks in just about every county, and likely that will continue to expand.
Perfect. I appreciate you answering all these questions. These are important to our listeners. Where does Ohio stand on a national scale in terms of the tick population as well as infectious diseases?
Now that I don't know.
Okay.
The majority of what I would do would be more Ohio specific. But I do like to, when I do presentations, I say Ohio is on the front lines of tick expansion. We just got in the last basically 10 to 15 years 4 new ticks, and we went from 1 to 5. And we have the true invasive Asian longhorn. We now have Gulf Coast. We've got a lot, but where we stand, I would like us to be in 50th place,
No
but
joke.
Unfortunately, I don't think we're there.
I think I saw a research, and I'm not 100. I think it was like 2020 or 2021 through the CDC, and it had a geographic map of where things were, and they were color coded. And I think Ohio at that point was in the 21 to 32 range, kind of about midway. So take that for what it's worth. That's been a couple of years ago, and obviously, as we found out today, there's 2 more additions to that since then. So, excuse me. We kind of touched on this one a little bit already, but seems to be like while most of the severe diseases, there have been medical strides towards. Have there been any medical strides towards curing alpha-gal or Lyme disease, which we had kind of touched about a little bit? They're currently working on that. Hopefully, and that would be more along the lines of prevention in terms of vaccination, but maybe towards the actual curing of that. Have you seen any strides to that?
So for Lyme disease is caused by a spirochete bacteria. So there are antibiotics that your physician can prescribe to treat that condition. For alpha-gal, with it being immune function mediated, it's a whole different beast that way.
Sure. Yeah, like we talked about earlier, the immune system is kind of a tricky thing, If someone were to be in contact, and you might not know the answer to this, but let's say a parent has Lyme disease or alpha-gal, is there any concern for them in terms of pregnancy or transmitting that disease further to their offspring or to their young child?
Oh, I have to refer any human medical specific questions to a human physician.
Yeah, see your physician on that one. That was one. I kind of figured that you weren't going to give me an answer on that one, but I did want to ask it just in case.
I gave you a great answer.
You gave me the
Talk to your doctor.
You gave me the DMV answer or DVM answer, so that's perfect. Excuse me. I have a question here. Is there any particular trees or plants that ticks tend to gravitate towards? I've heard this person's heard that ticks really like to stay in willow trees, for an example.
I would not say that I would consider trees to be prime tick habitat.
Okay.
I would say that they're going to be closer to the ground. That is where they're going to find their ideal habitat between questing and feeding. They don't fly. They actually run kind of fast for how small they are.
Yeah.
But they're not big jumpers, so they're going to be on the ground and they're going to crawl up for their questing spots. But I would not say they are going to be up in the trees, really. If they get carried up there by a bird, potentially, but you're going to find them more in the understory brush.
And then lastly here, this isn't one I had written down, but I did have it on top of my mind. As an adult, I can feel confident in spraying my hunting clothes with permethrin. Those are my hunting clothes. Those are what I'm going to be out in. If I have my children and they're playing in their backyard swing set, would you still treat, let's say, tennis shoes? I mean, because they're always going to be wearing the different clothes, I guess is what I'm getting at. She's wearing different leggings or different T-shirts or whatever have you. Would you typically tend to just treat their footwear with that, at least to kind of help mitigate some risk, or more or less just a thorough tick check when they come back in every day? Or both?
I don't really have like, you have to do exactly that.
Sure.
What I tell folks is you have a whole set of tools in your toolbox and best management practices. I highly recommend that you continue your education on tick-safe behaviors, figure out what is the best way to keep my family tick-safe based on our habitat, our lifestyle, what we do, and our pets and things like that, and then do your research, talk to your doctor, talk to your vet, to make sure that you are practicing the best tick-safe behaviors that you can.
Perfect. Well, I'll leave you with any final thoughts. So is there any current projects or any current work that you're excited about that you're working on?
Well, I can tell you that what I'm excited about is I don't know of, and I should knock on wood, any new ticks on the immediate horizon coming for Ohio.
Perfect.
Could that change tomorrow?
Sure.
Potentially. But we knew we had Asian longhorn tick coming. We knew we had Gulf Coast tick coming. And right this split second, I don't know of any new stuff coming. But when it comes, I will let you know. I'll come back on and we'll talk about it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, the that big old river below us definitely helps out quite a bit, I would say, on some of that regard too,
I wish it helped. I wish it helped more. Ticks seem to ignore it and just come right across.
No doubt. And then lastly, just any final thoughts that you have or any reminders that you can give the audience. I know we had mentioned contacting your local health professional, but another resource that I haven't heard you mention yet, which is clearly it's in every county, but you can also see your extension office as well. So give us a time to plug your extension and any other type of final thoughts or important reminders that you would have someone.
Thank you for that. So yes, you will find extraordinarily helpful information from your local extension office. We have offices in all 88 counties in Ohio. While I'm in Franklin County, you have one in your county. The way you find it is countyname.osu.edu. So you guys will go to licking.osu.edu. And then if you need outreach materials or fact sheets or something like that, then they can help with that.
Perfect. And the last time I heard you speak, you didn't have any social accounts, but are you on the social game yet, or where can people find you if they want either find you in terms of your research or any other websites or links that you can give people that will allow them to kind of find your work?
So we are actually building that new link of the future, and I don't have that to share right now,
Okay.
But we're working with the Knowledge Exchange, which is our data engagement group here in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. And hopefully soon, I will have a one-stop shop link where you can go in, find all of your information, prevalence data, safe behaviors, and everything like that. And that'll be our landing spot, because right now we got a little bit of stuff all over the place with lots of different organizations. Sure. And I'm going to wait till we get our perfect spot.
Perfect. And when you do, send it our way, and we'll definitely help try to
coming your way.
Perfect.
100%.
Awesome. Well, Tim, I thank you for this creepy conversation. It's been great, but I think, like I said, it's very. You never make someone leave happy, right? No, you're in the bad spot there, but. No, I think it's very important, and this is why we wanted to have you on. As soon as we got into the season, I'm actively going to be sitting in brush where I'm going to encounter these by, 100%. And so, if you're going to put yourself in harm's way there, or even mowing your grass,
or out fishing, or what have you.
So Ben is my resident angler, and I think I'm going to take up fishing on a boat in the middle of a lake. Maybe there might not be any tick population out there. We'll never know.
Boom. Let's hope not.
Yeah, until we start getting ones that fly and swim.
Yeah, hopefully not. Jeez.
Well, Tim, we really do appreciate your time this morning, and it's very important information, and we hope tons of people took away a lot of good stuff from it. I know we did. So,
thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, everyone, that is all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed that creepy conversation with Dr. McDermott. Listen, we know that ticks are definitely not anyone's favorite, but it's super important for everyone to understand the very real risk that they pose, and we hope this podcast helped you a little bit more with that. As a reminder, we are on a bi-weekly schedule, so our next episode will be on Tuesday, April 25th. And as always, we appreciate you listening. And until next time, enjoy the pursuit.